Hi, my name's Dr. Quentin Black. I'm the Clinical Director for the South Australian Specialist Gambling Help Service, which is brought to us by the Gambling Rehabilitation Fund and the South Australian Government. Today, we're going to put on a webinar as part of the Gambling Harm Awareness Week, an area that our service and PsychMed, the Wellbeing Recovery Research Institute, Adelaide University, University of South Australia, Deakin University and CQU have been very keen on supporting in public information around this area. As people would be aware, we normally, part of our role is to host gambling help service training and updates for South Australia. Also, we broadcast these on the websites and things so people around Australia and New Zealand also, I know, tune into our podcasts and are avid fans of our guest speaker today. So I'll introduce him in a moment. But first, I'd just like to acknowledge a few of the people that have supported this program, this education program, and also the Specialist Gambling Support Service, and some of our colleagues from the other gambling help services that will be tuning in today, such as CASA, OCA, the Aboriginal Family Support Service, Relationships Australia, Uniting Communities, and Community Transition Oars. We thank them for the collaborative relationship we have. I'd like to acknowledge the Honourable Michelle Lenzik, the Minister responsible for the Gambling Help Services, and the Opposition spokesperson, Nat Cook, and also the Honourable Nick Xenophon, who's also, all three of these people have been strong supporters of this specialist program, and indeed all the gambling help services. So thank you very much, and I hope this is an interesting webinar. In fact, I'm sure it will be an interesting webinar because our guest speaker today is Dr. Alex Russell. He's a senior postdoctoral fellow in experimental gambling research laboratory at the Central Queensland University. I've known Alex for quite a few years now, and he has very generously given his time to public education projects that myself and other people like Dr. Oakes and Nikki Dowling and a few others have been involved in trying to raise public awareness about this really important issue. So today, Alex has kindly offered to talk to us about video games are becoming more like gambling. And those of us who have younger clients, or indeed, well, actually, it's not even younger clients now, is it, Alex? But those of us who have any male clients and often female clients now too, will be well aware of this issue and the growing importance of it. So why does it matter? And who is at most risk from these changes? So hopefully Alex will talk to us about these issues now. So I'll just hand over to Jane, first of all, who's the clinical lead for the South Australian Intensive Gambling Help Service, just to see if she wants to say anything about Alex, and also acknowledge the work of Quy Lee, our coordinator for the program, who's put a lot of work into organising today. So Jane, I'll just hand over to you.
Thank you, Quentin. I'd just like to welcome Alex today and thank him for once again talking to our team and those people who have attended today. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
All right, thanks everyone. Thank you, Quinn and Jane. Always lovely to talk, and thanks to everyone at PsychMed as well. Always lovely to talk with you. We used to do this in person. I'm looking forward to being able to do that again, hopefully next year. Let's see how we go. So hopefully you can see my screen now there as well. That should be coming through. Great, cool. So I'm Alex Russell. I work with the team in the Experimental Gambling Research Lab at CQUniversity. So we focus a lot on gambling, but there's been a lot more interest in video games these days as well. I'm going to talk about why. So what's changed in video games over the last little while and why we're looking at them from a gambling perspective. So I've got about 3 or so of our studies, quite recent studies that I'm going to run through. A lot of them are based in, all of them actually are based in New South Wales, but this kind of thing with video games is pretty universal. Like, there's not that much in the way of jurisdictional differences. So while I'm at CQUniversity, so Central Queensland University, I actually live in northern Wollongong, so wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners here, the Dharawal people, and their elders past, present and emerging. A couple other housekeeping things before I get into things as well is it's becoming pretty custom for researchers to declare where they get their money from. Most of my funding, the vast majority of it, comes from government bodies. So Gambling Research Australia, New South Wales Office for Responsible Gambling. We do have a South Australian project on sports betting, which will be out very soon. We've submitted the report, so that'll be out pretty soon. I've also had travel funds paid for by a bunch of people, including SAIGHS in the past when we used to do these in person. So I think we're going to have some time at the end for questions, but I'm really open here. If if anything pops up and you just want to come off mute and throw a question out, then please feel very free to go for it. It's sometimes hard for me to catch something in the chat, but I'll try my best there too. So, you don't have to wait until the end if something really pressing comes up or if something I say isn't really very clear. Okay, so a bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First up, I'm going to define what gambling is, or the way that we think about it. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to try and highlight how video games are becoming more like that, and why that might be an issue. Talk about gaming a little bit as well, but I think we all have a pretty good idea of what gaming is, but there's sort of a broad variety of games available. A lot of people tend to think of like console games, where you're sitting in front of a TV with like an Xbox or something like that. But, we're also talking about things like apps on your phones or your tablets. There's a wide variety of things that fall under this. We'll talk about how video games used to work and how they work now. And then I'm going to talk about some of the research about who's playing these games and how it links with gambling and who's most at risk from problems from it. All right, so let's define gambling, and we're going to keep coming back to this. So the idea of gambling is, the first thing is that you put something of value at risk. All right, so it's usually money, but it doesn't have to be money. It can be anything that you value. So we see, for example, a lot of Indigenous communities gamble with food. People in prison gamble with cigarettes or whatever. It doesn't have to be money, but it often is. What happens in terms of, the outcome, like whether you win a bet or not, is determined at least in part by chance. And so there can be some skill involved. So things like being very good at playing poker, because there are skills in that, or sports betting or race betting where you can look at the odds and all those things. There's a degree of skill involved in that, but there's still some chance. This team might have been expected to win, but they didn't because something happened. So how much chance there is, that really differs across jurisdictions. So in Australia, it just needs to be a little bit of chance, whereas in the US, there needs to be predominantly, the outcome predominantly based on chance. So we see things a little bit different to overseas jurisdictions, and that's kind of important when you're looking at overseas studies as well, including about video games and all the discussion around gambling there too. We have different perspectives on what we consider to be gambling. And then the last thing is that something of value is won if you win the bet. Okay, so something of value in, degree of chance involved, something of value out. And I'm going to show you how video games have become like that. All right, so we're also seeing that technology is changing things at a really fast pace. So with gambling, for example, you used to go to a venue to place a bet, like at the pub or something like that, or you could make a phone call. These days, just about everything's online, okay, including via your smartphone. Everyone's got a smartphone in their pocket. That's how it works. So this is very much the same as what's happened with video games. You used to go to a venue to buy a disc that you would put in your computer. And these days, you can download them from app stores, often for free to start off with. So let's talk about the models of how video games work in terms of payment, so that you can understand, what's changing and why we're concerned about it. So originally buy a game up front. Now we're moving a bit more to a subscription model for some games. We're seeing this with lots of other software too. So things like Adobe products, like Photoshop and all that, are now on a subscription model rather than paying up front. So you pay for access for a certain amount of time. And once you stop paying, you don't have access anymore. Another model is where you don't even have to pay up front, and you can play a game for free to start off with. But then you can buy stuff as the game progresses. And the idea about these purchases is they allow you to move more quickly through the game. And so if you don't make those purchases, you can usually still progress. Sometimes you might reach a certain part where they won't let you pass that without paying, but you can usually still progress. But payment brings faster progress, and faster progress through these games often makes you more competitive against other people. So that's a useful thing for players to be paying for. It gets people to do better at these games for money. And it's an easy way in, rather than spending all this time developing skills to be better at these games. The most extreme example of this is where you can pay to access things that give you a competitive advantage, not just progressing through the game more quickly, but better weapons, or whatever the game requires to be the best at it. And if you don't have those, you're not competitive. So you might be free to get into the game to start off with, but when you are playing for free and not paying, everyone else is so much better than you in the game because they've paid for an advantage. And so a lot of games are really working on this pay to win mentality these days. All of these things are about extracting as much money from people as possible. So, it's that free entry in that sucks people into the game, and you start playing and you start building up a profile. And then you get to a point where, well, I'm invested in this, and if I want to do any better, I'm going to have to pay. The problem with this is that there's no cap on most games to how much you can pay. So again, going back away, when you used to buy discs in stores, you would pay up front, right? You might pay $100 for the game, but then that was all you paid. All right. They might offer some downloadable levels later if you wanted to, but those were add-ons. You didn't have to do those to go through the game. There was a cap at how much you could pay. These days, starting with the App Store, but also on console games, you can often get into a game for free, and then you have to pay for in-app purchases to unlock stuff. So these are the pay to win or the level up sort of mentality. Some games are free. Some of them are ad supported as well, so you can watch ads instead. Some of them you can pay to enter, but you'll notice that this one here is also offering in-app purchases. So you pay to enter and then keep paying more. And probably the most common model is we'll let you play the game for free to start off with, but you need to pay for these in-app purchases to keep going. And like I said, there's no cap. So before, high barrier of entry into a game, $100, say, for the really big, most popular games, really stops a lot of particularly younger people who don't have much disposable income getting into the game in the first place. Developers have realized that they're quite happy to give the game away for free to most people on the hope that there's going to be a bunch of people who pay a lot. And that's precisely what we see. We see through these in-app sort of purchase mechanisms, a lot of people paying a lot per game, like thousands per game, because there is no cap, rather than hitting this $100 and that's all you pay. It's become a much more lucrative model. And the reason is because of these high spenders. And of course, these are the people who are most at risk of problems. All right, let's talk about a couple of categories of games in terms of how they link with gambling a little bit, just to define some terms here for you, because you'll need to see these for the research later on. All right, one form of games that's popped up is social casino games. So these are games that look and feel like gambling. They're basically simulated gambling products. You can play a pokey on your phone, or you can play poker or a scratch card, or all sorts of different forms of gambling. And a lot of these are free to enter to start off with. And if you want to, you can pay money into the game as well to get extra credits to spend at the tables and things. Normally they'll give you a certain amount of credits per day. And once those credits run out, if you want to keep playing, you have to pay, and you can pay every day to get more of those credits. Or sometimes you can watch ads as well. But again, there's usually a limit to how much you can do there. So these things are gambling themed games. You might pay to enter if you want to, but you can't win any money. So thinking about our definition of gambling, you can put money in. There's a degree of chance about whether you're going to win, just like other forms of gambling, but you can't ever take your winnings out of these games. So what this means is they're not classified as gambling products, and these things are freely available to people who are under 18 because they're just games. That's how they're seen anyway. They're not seen as gambling products. So this leads to some, regulatory issues and, exposure for young people. It also leads to an extent to normalization of gambling for young people too. They see these things, they see it as normal. These things are heavily advertised in other games as well. The other concern about these things is because they're not regulated as gambling products, they're not subject to the same kinds of laws as gambling products in terms of, say, required payouts. So a poker machine in a club or a pub is required to pay out at around about 90% return to player in the long run. But a social casino game could be set to pay out 110% in the long run. These could be made to seem profitable. You can't take the winnings out, so it doesn't matter to the game developers. They can have you winning more than you put in because you can't cash it out. But that might lead someone to believe that, hey, I'm kind of good at these pokey things. Maybe I should go and give a real one a go. So these are some of the concerns that are popping up around social casino games. They're freely available to people under 18. They don't necessarily reflect real gambling, and they're readily available on your phone. And you can keep paying to play if you want to. So that's one particular form of games that we're having a look at. And those have been around for a while now. We're pretty aware of those issues. One of the more recent things that's been popping up is a thing called a loot box. So this is where we get into the territory where when you start talking about these things, parents in particular are sitting there going, I've heard these terms. I don't know what it is. I don't know what you're talking about. And this is one of the major challenges in terms of dealing with this area is loot boxes and skin gambling and everything. Parents don't know much about it at all. So let's talk about it a little bit, not so much that, not to help you educate parents necessarily, if you want to, that's fine, but more to explain where the issue is with these things. And I'm going to talk about some loot box research in a sec. So I mentioned, let's pick a game like, a game where you run around shooting people and you're playing online against other people who are trying to shoot you, okay? What you can get in those games is a thing called a loot box, which is an opportunity to open this thing up and win something inside it. And the kinds of things you can win, they might be, they're often called skins. They might be something like a gun that shoots straighter, right? So an actual functional element to help you in the game. Often though, they're not. Often they're something that is more cosmetic. They just make your player look different and they don't actually make your player any better. But some of these things that you can win in the loot boxes, these skins, are very valuable because there's only one like that in the world. And people are actually paying money for these things. So these loot boxes, let me take it back a second. These loot boxes, you can earn them in the game just by playing it for a long time, or you can pay to get them. So, 50 loot boxes here will cost you $60, and I think that's US. So, it's quite a bit of money to put in. Most of these loot boxes that people open are going to contain something that's not really that useful to them, but some will. So there's a degree of chance about what you're going to get. So you've got money in and a degree of chance. Can you get money out? Does it meet the gambling criteria? Kind of. Depends on the game. Some games you can. So here's an example of the kind of thing that you might win in a loot box, right? So here's some different skins, like, there's a particular thing that makes your character look this way, or particular dances that they do when they win or whatever. And these all sound really trite and, really a lot of adults in particular just kind of don't get it. But for younger people, these mean, or people who are really into the games, these mean a lot because they're a symbol of status. If you've got one of these rare skins, so they're called like epics or legendaries and those things, they're in tiers. If you get one of these really good skins, it's a symbol of status in the game, and other people come up against you and see you in this rare skin, means you must have played a lot to get that. So it gives you some status. Now, the thing about these skins is in some games, you can actually sell them to other players. So up until now, things that you earned in games, they were kind of stuck with your character. You couldn't give them to someone else in the game. But these skins, there are marketplaces where you can sell them. And I mentioned that some of these skins are pretty rare, like there's only one of them in the world. This might surprise you, but people will pay tens of thousands of dollars for them, for the really rare ones. So you can put money in to buy a loot box. There's a degree of chance involved in terms of what you get out of it, whether you get a really good thing or not, and it's got value. So this actually seems like gambling. Meets the definition anyway. And that's why loot boxes in other countries like the Netherlands and Belgium are actually classified as gambling products. But we haven't done that in Australia. The governments are kind of saying we're waiting to see the research. Well, we've got the research. It looks like maybe something should be done here. Skins can be sold for money on marketplaces. They can also be used on offshore websites. So these aren't allowed in Australia, but it's not hard for people to get access to them as currency for gambling. So there's a bunch of websites here where you can sign up quite easily, deposit whatever skins you've got out of your game, and you can go and play roulette, or you can go and play various other chance-based gambling forms. So they're not allowed in Australia. And if young people are accessing them offshore and say get ripped off or something, there's no recourse for them. There's nothing that you can do. And these games are also more heavily stacked against the player. So you might know with like a roulette wheel, there's 36 numbers plus the green 0. And it's the green 0 that's the house edge. In this case, there's only, I think it's 14 numbers plus the green 0. So this is even more stacked against the player than a usual roulette wheel. Really importantly, these things don't have very strong age verification checks. So this is an example of how to log in. You log in, say, with your Steam account, which is where your skins are stored, for example. And to show that you're 18, you just check this checkbox here to say, I'm 18, and that's it. That's all you got to do. Okay, so it's not hard for young people to get access to these things, even though they shouldn't. And they're using these skins for gambling. So let's think about the context there. The loot box itself is probably gambling, money in, degree of chance, a skin of value has come out. And then you've gone and used that skin potentially to gamble more. So it's kind of double gambling. So you can see, there's these big links now between games and gambling that aren't that obvious, because something like a loot box, it doesn't really look like gambling, does it? But it's got the same kind of underlying mechanisms. So people don't make that, connection so easily. The other thing we're seeing is esports. So esports are just like sporting contests, except the sport is a video game. So esport is like electronic sports. And these things, again, are competitive. They'll have different esports, one for like Counter-Strike Global Offensive, one for Dota 2, all these like popular sorts of games. And people go and play them competitively against each other. These things pack out huge stadiums. They've really become like, I'm like just past 40. And if you think going back to school, like 20 years ago, kids who played video games were not that popular and no one really wanted to watch. These days, they're packing out massive stadiums. And they're all sponsored by betting companies. And you can bet on it. So here's a sense of what it's like, right? This guy's coming in, huge screen, people cheering. This is all streamed online as well. So it's not just the people in the venues who are watching. Obviously that closed down a little bit with COVID, but starting to come back through. these are really, really big events. And, back in 2018, so this is a few years ago, like the global audience was like 400 million people already. So this is kind of taking off. So not only is there potentially gambling within the video games in terms of things like loot boxes, because most esports tend to have loot boxes and those kinds of mechanics in them, there's also actually betting on people playing the games professionally. So, a lot of gambling popping up around here. One more thing to point out, and this isn't such a huge deal, but it's becoming more popular, is this thing called daily fantasy sports. So again, this is sort of started around video games. Like you could put together teams of players and they would earn points based on how the real player actually went that week in the game that they played. And you would usually build that up over a season. So you would try to put together the best team that you could. You might trade players with mates if one of your players isn't going so well. But it would take a season to work out who was going to be the winner. And, in real sports terms, a season is, months of play. So there's a long gap between when you started playing that and when you got the payout of who won or not. These days we're moving to daily fantasy sports. So these things are becoming very quick. You can just bet on what's happening on a particular weekend. And there are online gambling operators that are popping up too. So, again, a lot of this is younger people getting into sports and idolizing their players and things like that. Younger men in particular are getting into it, especially the daily version of it. It's not so much in and around video games, but there are fantasy sports versions of video games too. So just something to be aware of. All right, so let's have a look just to take things back a little bit at how this all links to gambling. So remember, something of value in, whether there's a degree of chance involved or not, and something of value out. So gambling ticks all these boxes, right? Your standard betting on sports. Social casino games tick all those boxes, except you can't take your winnings out of the game. So they're not classified as gambling. Loot boxes, yes, you can put something of value in. You can also get free loot boxes earned during the game. There is chance involved in what's in there, although some loot boxes are clear, like in Fortnite, for example, you know what you're going to get. And something of value out, it depends on the game. So some games you can sell the skins, some games you can't, but the more popular ones you can. Betting on esports, that is just flat out gambling. It's just like betting on sports. Skin gambling, so using those skins you get in video games to bet on those online websites, flat out gambling as well. Even though, skins, it's not money, right? You don't necessarily know that's worth $2 or $100 or whatever. There's that disconnect between what it's worth and what you can use it for. And then finally, fantasy sports. Yes, you can pay to play, particularly the daily fantasy sports you do. There is a degree of chance involved in whether you win or not. Sure, there's a lot of skill, but degree of chance involved. And you can get something of value out because there are usually prize pools as well. But there's one other factor here that I want you to think about in terms of these things is whether or not these kind of look and feel like gambling, because that's what sort of, separates a little bit of this out too. So I'm going to add in another column and we're going to see, gambling, look, it looks like gambling. We understand that placing a bet on a sporting contest, that's what gambling looks and feels like, right? But a lot of these things don't. So, while loot boxes might, meet the technical definitions of what gambling is, most people don't think of it like that. They understand there's a risk involved, but they don't think of it as gambling per se. Same with things like fantasy sports here. They think it's more a contest of skill in terms of picking the best team rather than gambling per se. And if there's a little bit of money on the line, that's okay. So you can see there's some fuzzy areas here in terms of what's popping up, all sorts of different games and different things that are coming out that kind of, explore some blurred areas here, some gray areas, and that makes regulation pretty difficult too. One of the biggest issues, though, is the monetization of video games. This idea of free to play versus paying to win. And we wanted to explore that a little bit because that's one thing that sets games apart from gambling, is that there aren't really free to play versions of gambling. Nothing where you can try to start off with for free and take your winnings out. Whereas you can with, say, a loot box that you earn in the game, you can potentially earn a skin that's worth some money. So I wanted to explore that a little bit. I'm going to touch on the first bit of research, which is a recent one. It came out last year, and this was in New South Wales, funded by the New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling. And what I wanted to do with this was to have a look at how gambling is changing, but with also a focus on video games too. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the gambling stuff here, but more on the gaming, just so that you can get a sense of what's happening. And the focus here really was amongst younger people, like 18 to 29-year-olds. We did a lot of other stuff in this study as well. We looked at, when people started playing, when they were underage and things like that too. So we'll talk about that. But the whole idea was to have a look at what the youngest people who are just 18, and so 18 to 24-year-olds in particular, are doing compared to people who are just a little bit older. Because we had a sense that there was a bit of a changing, like a generational shift here. And so let's see what we found. So for this one, we did an online survey. We had about 2,000 people in it, and about half were that 18 to 24-year-old group, and about half were 25 to 29-year-olds. Part of why we chose this as well is those people who are 18 to 24, they've kind of been around while some of these newer forms have been out. So particularly things like loot boxes have only been around for a few years. Whereas the older group, when they turned 18, they weren't around. So, if they wanted to get engaged in this sort of stuff, they'd have to do something else because loot boxes weren't necessarily as dominant anyway. So we looked at a lot of stuff. We looked at their lifetime engagement in traditional forms of gambling. So that's things like pokies and sports betting and race betting and lotteries and all that. But also these emerging forms. So things like esports, daily fantasy sports, those sorts of things. So whether they've done in their lifetime, the last 12 months, and the results for those are very similar. So I'm not going to present both. The age that they first used each of these forms, the traditional and emerging ones as well, and whether they'd had problems. And then, look, there's a bunch of other stuff in the report as well, but this is just, headline kind of findings. So this graph is the proportion of respondents who had gambled on traditional forms in the last 12 months. And the blue bars there, the taller bars, that's the older group. That's the 25 to 29-year-olds. And I don't know, is it green? I'm a guy. I'm terrible with colors. Whatever the lighter color is. That's the 18 to 24-year-olds. And so we can see here on all of the traditional forms, so the first one's lotteries, then scratchies, then pokies, then sports betting, race betting, pretty much all of them, the younger group aren't doing it as much, which is kind of surprising in a way, because normally, you kind of turn 18 and you go and just have a bet. That's what you do. Same as you go to the pub, basically the night you turn 18. And we're seeing a little bit less of that. But one of the reasons for this might be because more of them are first betting when they're underage. So they might be getting it out of their system at a younger age because everything's a bit more accessible these days. It's easier to get access to stuff online than it is in a venue. You go to a pub to play the pokies and you get challenged on the door every time you go in. Well, there's the opportunity for them to check your ID. Whether or not they do it is a different thing. With online, once you've got your betting account open, that's it. They don't ask for your ID again. So there's a lot more stuff available online these days. All right, what about emerging forms? What about things like, in and around video games? So not all of the emerging forms here are video games, but a lot of them are. So remember, in terms of engagement, so this is still the traditional forms. Remember, it was the older people who were doing it more. In terms of these emerging forms, it's the younger people who are doing it a bit more. All right, so the first three here as well, the most popular ones, are some of the ones where you don't necessarily need to pay to enter. So this is like earning a loot box rather than paying for one. Or playing video games that have gambling bits in them. So something like playing Grand Theft Auto, which has this whole casino level going on, is more popular amongst the younger people than the older people. Or just playing esports in general. So, they're getting access to all of these types of, or exposure to gambling type things, but they're not paying for them. And that's, one of the things for younger people is they don't have that money to be able to, pay for a lot of gambling. A lot of young people don't have a lot of money. So this free entry thing is particularly appealing to young people who are looking for something to do with their time. All right, now just like we have that underage thing for traditional forms of gambling, I have it here for emerging forms of gambling, but it's not necessarily a problem that they're doing it underage here, because none of these are restricted, apart from a few things down here. So I do have esports betting in here, and even then they're doing those underage. Right? So these things, because they're not regulated, apart from things like esports betting here, or should be regulated, but young people can still get access to them, they're doing these things more too. So they're getting more exposure to gambling while underage, even though some of these things aren't technically classified as gambling. All right? Whereas older people, this wasn't around so much when they were underage. So, this proliferation of these products now seems to be something that younger people are going for. All right, what about how these things are linked with harm? Well, so the question here is, do these things that sort of, look and feel like gambling and may be classified as gambling in some cases, like loot boxes, are they actually being linked with gambling and gambling harm? Like, is it a problem? Are we just getting worked up about nothing? And it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be that, the kinds of people who play these games are also the kinds of people who experience gambling harm. Now, I can't say that playing these games causes you to have gambling harm, because we can't, we would need to run an experiment to do that. We would need to randomly allocate some people to play these games and randomly allocate other people not to play these games and see who gets harmed. And we can't do that because these games are just readily available. It's also slightly unethical. But it seems that these things are linked. All right, at the very least, the kinds of people who experience gambling harm and are vulnerable to these sorts of things are the kinds of people that these games appeal to. And that tells us quite a bit too. There is a good trend that we saw as well, which is that in the past, we've seen that a lot, and I'm going to come back to this with the next study, I think. One of the biggest things that we've seen, one of the facilitators here is parents. And they can be actively facilitating access to gambling and gaming by, letting kids use their online gambling accounts, for example. We have seen quite a bit of that. Or it can be, a little more passive, like they're playing video games themselves and the kids see that and that's normalized for them too. We're actually seeing that that's dropping. So there's a bit of a lower exposure through parents for the younger cohort. So some of the things that we're have been focusing on is things like education around parents and being aware of your own behaviours, and not just in gambling and gaming. We've seen it in smoking and drinking and other sorts of things too. And we're seeing that there seems to be a bit of a lower trend there amongst parents and their exposure, kids having exposure through their parents, which is a good thing. I'm going to come back to that because I'm going to show you why that's important in a second. We're going to move on to the next study here, which is the New South Wales Youth Gambling Study. So that study that I just talked about, that was 18 to 29-year-olds. What about people who are underage? What about people who are younger? So this one was led by my boss, Nerily Hing, and also funded by New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling. They've been keeping us very busy. And let's talk about people who are 12 to 17. What's happening with them? So again, we're focusing on gambling, but we did a lot on gaming in here too. So of the 12 to 17-year-olds, about 43% had gambled at some point in their life. So we're talking here the traditional gambling forms, access to pokies and sports betting, about 4 in 10. Like, it's a lot higher than I was expecting because it's meant to be restricted, right? When we look at the last year, the last 12 months, it's about 3 in 10. So it's still pretty high. But what was interesting here is there was the most popular thing for younger people to do was to take part in informal private betting, which is things like, playing a game of cards for money at school in lunch or something with each other. So that was one of the most popular. And if we look at the commercial forms of gambling, so, sports betting, pokies, that sort of thing, it was about, I think, 21% off the top of my head. We found here that online gambling, like I was talking about before, is usually easier for people because there's fewer checks of ID. And in particular here, amongst the 12 to 17-year-olds, we found it was those who were getting closer to 17, like 15, 16, 17, who are more likely to be involved In some cases, their parents actively gave them access to their betting accounts as well, which is interesting. But one of the other sources here was through, older siblings or older friends who are over 18 who might help them set up betting accounts. But we're here to talk about gaming. So let's talk about how we looked at gaming. We used a lot of the same things that I used in the other study, but there's a couple of extra things that we looked at here too. So we had loot boxes and we had betting with in-game items here, so that's skin gambling. But we also had a few other things as well. So, for example, a lot of casino sites have a demo version of their games that you can play on their websites there. So we looked at those too. We found, so there's a bit on the screen, but let's do it. We found that about 40% of people had played games with gambling components. So this is not necessarily loot boxes. This is sort of the lower level, just games that have a bit of gambling stuff in them. And we also found that about 72% had played games with loot boxes in them. All right, so loot boxes, very, very prominent, but remember that you can get them just from opening them from playing a lot. About half of those had actually paid to open them. So that's still quite a lot of young people who are paying to open, to get loot boxes. And as I said, it seems that that's pretty close to a form of gambling. We also found that in terms of the skin gambling thing, betting on offshore websites, it's about 14% or so of people who do it. Now, this is very much a male thing that's involved, but it was sort of across all kinds of age groups here, 12 to 17 as well, because they're just so accessible. And because all you have to do to show your age is tick a box. It's not hard to do. Having problems from games, about 5%. So when we look at, gambling problems, if we look at the pointy end of gambling problems, it's usually about 1 to 2%, give or take. Games, a lot more, because they're a lot more accessible. And they're also lower levels. These are the people who are at the pointy end. There are lower levels of problems too. But, this is the pointy end. And it seems to be a little bit higher than what's been seen in global prevalence figures, but not a huge difference. This is higher amongst males, but again, no age differences. So 12 to 17-year-olds, gaming problems pretty evenly spread through that sort of group there. Compared to problem gambling, which is 1.5%, and problem and at-risk gambling, which includes some of the lower levels of gambling, games are a lot more of a problem. So what predicts problems? Well, let's have a look at gambling first, because I want to compare what predicts problems in gambling versus what predicts problems in gaming for 12 to 17-year-olds. So we had a bunch of different categories of predictors here that we considered, like their own sort of, personal variables, including demographics. Impulsiveness always comes out. People who are impulsive, this is one of the strongest predictors of gambling or gaming problems around. It's a vulnerability essentially. A lot of the problem with gambling and gaming is being able to say no or when to stop, and people who are impulsive, very hard to do. We looked at parents, and parents are a really big factor, both in terms of some of those active things that they were doing, like actually gambling with their kids, or whether they experience problems themselves. That's, again, if your parents have problems from gambling, again, a really big predictor for you having problems from gambling. But also like some of the things that they did, like setting rules around how they can use the internet, at what times of day they're allowed to use it, or talking about e-safety. So things like, this is what something dangerous online looks like, and here's how you stay safe, for example. Parental approval was a big one too. Peers were also important as well. So what their friends are doing, we know that social influences are a really big thing, and I've done a bunch of research on that in the past. And there's a few other things here which I won't worry too much about, but we did find that simulated gambling, these gaming type things were also predictors for gambling problems too. Doesn't mean that they cause them, just means that they were linked. So that's gambling. What about gaming? We see something pretty similar. There's a few less predictors in here, but again, it's things like higher impulsiveness comes out as a big predictor here. People who have lower well-being too. And, reason for that often is that gaming and gambling offer an escape. If things aren't going that well in your life, You know, it's easy to just turn on a game and be someone else for a little while, or put all your energy into solving quests and those sorts of things. Parents come out as a factor, peers as well, and this online like belonging to a group of friends within a game, you know, really highlights the social aspects of a lot of these games, and I'll talk about that towards the end. Gambling and simulated gambling also predict gaming problems too. All right, so there's a few limitations around this one just to be aware of. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but this was meant to be a representative study. And normally we do that with phone calls, but it's kind of hard to just cold call people who are 12-year-olds, you know, doesn't look very good. So instead what we did was, one of the key things here is having random access to people. So we tried dropping letterboxes, pamphlets in their letterboxes, because, you know, pretty much everyone in New South Wales has a letterbox. So we tried that and it worked okay, except we found out that the people who sent out the flyers were a bit dodgy and binned a bunch of them. So I wouldn't recommend it in the future, but despite that, we had a look at the numbers and they seem pretty representative. So we're not unhappy despite those issues. All right, so just to put things into perspective, the green ones here are gambling and the blue ones here are video games. Video games is a big thing. So here's loot boxes, here's playing games with gambling bits in them versus the most popular form of gambling, which was informal private betting. All right, so these loot boxes, that's just the way that video games are monetized these days. So it's really in there, but as you can see, it's a problematic form of monetization because there's no cap to it. Let's talk about those loot boxes in a bit more detail. So this is another one that we did also by New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling, focusing specifically on loot boxes. This one led by the head of the lab, Matt Rockoff, and I've been involved in all of these. It's been a very busy 2 years. So I've talked a bit about what loot boxes are. You know, you open something up, you get something of value, skins or something like that in there. And the idea is that, you know, you're building up your skills, but these help you move forward a little bit further. And I want to talk about why loot boxes are kind of an interesting issue. So beyond just being, you know, something similar to gambling, there's a bunch of other factors in here too. So, you know, the first thing is these things are bundled, right? You know, if you're paying for a skin up front, you know what you're going to get versus paying more for a thing where you have the chance of winning something. It's kind of like, you know, subscribing to Netflix versus buying one particular movie through, say, Google, or, you know, going to Kmart and buying a DVD or whatever. You know, these subscription things have become pretty popular for a reason, and loot boxes are kind of more similar to this thing than they are to this, because you don't know what you're going to get. There is an issue about obfuscation of price, which is basically, you know, you don't necessarily know how much a skin is worth because values are fluctuating and all those things, and they have different values across different games too. So there's a bunch of issues there. But also, when these loot boxes open, they do it with this whole big fanfare. You know, all these lights go off, all these bells ring and all these things. You know, there's all sorts of, you know, visual and auditory excitement, which might remind you of pokies a little bit. They're exciting. They're interesting, they're entertaining. So even just the you know, the fact of unboxing them is made into this whole big event, and people get excited about that. So when you open a loot box to see what's in it. I'm not going to worry about the next slide, but let's get on to, we did a couple of things in the study. So Nancy Greer did this bunch of the most popular video games, I think about 90 or 80 something video games. And of those, 62% of them have loot boxes. And these are the most popular games. These are the most popular games by revenue. They're relying on loot boxes. That's how they're making their money. That's how much money is coming through from this. They're sustaining the biggest games around. Of those that have loot boxes in them, quiet Siri, of those who have loot boxes in them, most of the time you purchase them via a two-step process. So you don't even buy the loot box outright, you buy currency in the game, and then you use the currency in the game to buy the loot boxes. So again, it's kind of breaking that link between the money and the spending of the money. It's part of that obfuscation of price thing. Of those that have loot boxes, about 84% of them allowed the skins, the things that come out of them, to be traded. So they have value, right? So of these, you know, really most popular games in the world, the ones that have loot boxes in them, most of them have that mechanism where you can sell, or, you know, what you win out of it. So they seem to meet that criteria for gambling. So that's a bit of an issue. All right, so how many people are purchasing loot boxes? This was a sample also of about 2,000 people, and these were 12 to 24-year-olds. So we've got underage people, 12 to 17, and we also have some of those, like, you know, that first little bit of when you reach adulthood there. And we found that of all those people, about 93% had played a game with loot boxes. This isn't necessarily a representative sample. We expect these numbers to be a little bit higher versus the other studies. And most of those were aware of the presence of loot boxes in video games, but a lot weren't. So they told us they're playing these games, but didn't really know, you know, that there were loot boxes in there. Of those who were aware, you know, most of them had at least opened a loot box, right? Whether or not you paid for it, that's a different thing. So, you know, only about a third had paid for it, but people were using the loot box mechanism in the game. All right, and some of them had about, what is it, 7%, 6.8% had gone on to sell something that they'd won in a loot box too. So they've sort of fulfilled that this is a gambling thing, you know, they've won something in the game and gone to sell it for money. Right, and this is one of the things that makes loot boxes kind of interesting versus other forms of gambling is, you know, you can open a loot box and win a random reward that you haven't had to pay for. And there aren't, you know, you can potentially sell that thing, it still has value. And there aren't really gambling forms like that where they'll let you pay for free, but win something of value. You know, that doesn't really exist. Or you can purchase loot boxes, you can put money in yourself. You know, normally the ones that you earn during a game, you have to do quite a lot of playing to earn those loot boxes. So rather than doing that, you can just pay, and then you've got easier access to it. And then lastly, you can sell the items there too, which is kind of, you know, that final step. And, you know, we're seeing that that's happening a little bit. We've had a look amongst adults here for gender differences, and, you know, there's a lot of analyses here. So don't worry about all these numbers, just let me talk to you about it. The main thing here is we're seeing that buying loot boxes was linked with gambling for both men and women. Selling loot boxes, this is the adult component of the sample. This is 18 to 24-year-olds. Selling whatever you won in a loot box was also linked to gambling. So these kinds of things are popular amongst the same kinds of people who gamble as well. In terms of gambling problems, we found that this buying loot boxes and also selling what you get out of loot boxes was linked to gambling problems, both for men and women too. So, you know, we kind of have in our head that there's this gendered thing here in terms of loot boxes, and there is a little bit in terms of engagement with it, but amongst those who do it, there's no gender differences. So there's fewer women doing it, but the women who are doing it are just as likely to experience problems as the men who are doing it. So that's the adults. What about the kids in the sample? We did see a little bit more of a gender difference here. So in terms of young people here, we found that opening, buying and selling loot boxes was more linked to gambling problems amongst underage people. You know, again, this sort of maybe ties in, take part, the ones who do are more likely to experience harm. So we see this a little bit in terms of drinking, for example, as well. You know, we see more men coming in for treatment because, or boys coming in for treatment because there's more men or boys taking part, but amongst the women who do it, at least to the same extent, you know, there are sort of some issues there too. This is controlling for age, by the way. All right. My doorbell's going. Big picture. Let's get into games and links with gambling problems. So there's been a lot of research looking at relationships between video games and gambling problems. One of the things that we want to see a little bit more of, and we've been doing, is links with actually gaming problems themselves, because the games themselves bring their own problems, like too much engagement with games and not doing things like schoolwork or work, or missing, things that you're meant to be doing, lack of sleep, those things too. So I think we need to do a lot more work to look at the actual gaming problems themselves versus gambling. But, the gambling thing is important too. Don't get me wrong. That's why we've all been looking at it. We understand why gambling products themselves are addictive. We understand a lot about, the relationship between when you place the bet versus when you find out whether you've won or not. The amount of time there is a really big thing. That's what makes pokies so addictive, is you place your bet, you spin reel, and then you get your win straight away, and then you can keep doing that. Like, that short gap there is a really addictive thing. It leads into things like chasing losses and all that. With video games, they do work a bit differently. There's other components here. You don't really have a chat with someone when they're playing the pokies because they don't want to talk to you. But with video games, they're very social, for example. So understanding, what it is that makes games addictive is, I think, something that we need to look at a lot more. And Dan King at Flinders now around by Dan King there too. But we don't necessarily know why games are addictive, but we have some pretty good ideas of why they're appealing. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is they allow you to escape. You can play a game for a while and just tune out and forget your worries. So if you've got a whole bunch of bad stuff going on around you, or stressful events like a pandemic that's been going on for far too long, tuning out with a video game is a great way to just relax and unwind. You can develop problem-solving skills and other skills in these games. There's a lot of really positive aspects to these games in terms of learning skills. So I'm a parent of 2 young boys, and watching my boys on their iPads, we're trying to guide them towards games where they learn something rather than just games where they mindlessly tap stuff or whatever. And so, when you're fostering the positives out of these games, they may not be as bad. We'll see if my kids are, screwed up later in life. All right, social interaction is a big one as well. For a lot of kids, particularly school-age kids, being able to interact with your peers outside of school, is pretty handy. Not only is there social interaction there, there's also good, social status or social reward. So, again, going back to when I was in school, it was the sporty kids who were the really popular ones, and that's where you earn social credit. These days, you can earn a lot of social status from playing these games well. So that's becoming a pretty big thing, and a reason that people want to play these. And if you're not playing these games, then you're kind of left out, and you can't really catch it up at school because it's a lot of what people are talking about at school too. There is the potential to make money. Not many people do, but there is that potential. So that is a draw. That's an appeal of the game. And the last thing is they're very accessible. Everyone's got a smartphone in their pockets these days, and a lot of these are on smartphones. Even if you're not allowed to have a TV and game console in your room or at home, you can access these on your smartphone. And if your parents or whatever are saying no, don't do this and all that thing, you can still do it when you're out and about. They're problematic because while I mentioned they're good for escape, that's again a big predictor for gambling and gaming problems. If you come to rely on these games or gambling products to get you through a difficult time in your life, that's where the issues really start, when you have a reliance on these things. It potentially normalizes gambling. Having said that, there's a lot of normalization of gambling in society anyway. There are, gambling ads everywhere. Gambling is all over the TV. Kids in schoolyards can recite odds for the games coming up on the weekends and things like that. So, what's one more thing? We need to fight normalization beyond just games. And there's also potential migration between simulated and monetary gambling as well. Potentially, these are a gateway drug into monetary gambling. The evidence is a bit funny on that one. There's one more thing I want to talk about here in terms of social video games, which is a little bit different, is this concept of a person called a social influencer. So you know, I mentioned you can buy like a pack of 50 loot boxes on here. And there are people on YouTube who are gifted packs of 50 by games. And they'll create these videos where they open 50 loot boxes all in one hit. And it's the most boring thing you've ever seen. But they get tons of that out in a video. It makes it look like you get to win a lot more than you do. You don't see this so much with sports betting and pokies and things like that too. There's a bunch of other things that we can address here in terms of video games. There's plenty of things here, but one last thing to point out is this is where you can find more about us. So if you ever want to read any of my stuff, I'm really happy to do that. I think there's about 120 publications there now or something. And we have a group for our lab, sorry, a Facebook page for our lab where we sort of update whenever we've got findings. So here's most of our group. So this is Nerily Hing here, who led the New South Wales Youth Gambling Study, and Matt Rockoff, who led the loot box stuff. A bunch of our PhD students here as well. Matt Brown, who's been doing great stuff on gambling harm. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, this is where you can find me. I tweet about not just work and things, but just wanted to thank our funding bodies, the participants who take part, and my colleagues, because it's always a team effort.